Hello, everybody. This is Eric Martin. I'm a social science analyst with the National Institute of Justice. I am joined by my colleague, John McGrath. He is from the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences. And we're pleased today to be able to present to you a panel that we originally were intending to present at the 2020 meeting of the American Society of Criminology. As you know, given the current situation with the pandemic, a lot of conferences have been scaled back, but NIJ has decided to leverage technology and our resources to be able to bring you this same information. We were commenting that we think our attendance we're able to reach a broader audience than what was able to fit into the panel room. So we're pretty excited about that. We're co-chairs. We're going to give some comments at the end, but we have three amazing presenters for you all today. Before I get to that, just a disclaimer. We want to make sure that it's clear that the opinions and points of views expressed by all the panelists in the presentation do not reflect any official position or policy of the United States Department of Justice. And of course, any errors are our own. And now that that is out of, we've covered that, we want to get to, for those of you who may not know who we are, the National Institute of Justice is the research, development, and evaluation agency for the U.S. Department of Justice. We support criminal justice policy and practice through research, particularly at the state, local, and tribal level. We're going to talk a little bit about NIJ at the end, but just so you know, the panelists are going to be presenting primarily research that was funded in the past by NIJ. And we're excited to be able to bring this to you. Now to introduce the panelists we have today. This is going to be in the order that they're going to appear in our panel. First, we have James Anderson. He's the director of the Justice Policy Program and Institute for Civil Justice at RAND Corporation. He will be followed by Kevin Strom. He is the director of the Center for Policing Research and Investigative Science at RTI International. And then he will be followed by Danya Slack, who is a research forensic scientist also at RTI, but she is the associate director of the NIJ Forensic Technology of Excellence, Center of Excellence. So we're pleased that all three of these panelists took time out of their busy schedule to participate in today's panel. So now I am going to turn it over to James Anderson for the first presentation.
Thanks, Eric. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just make sure that everything's working here. All right, so good afternoon. I'm James Anderson from the RAND Corporation, and I'll present our research on forensic science and its efficacy overall. First, I want to thank NIJ for funding this research and my co-authors as well. It was a terrific multidisciplinary team. I'm a lawyer by training. Carl Matthews is a forensic scientist. Sarah Greathouse is a forensic psychologist. And Chari is an economist, so it was fun and I think illuminating to have a variety of perspectives on the research team to really try to figure out the effect of forensic science. All right, so I first want to talk about a little bit about the theoretical promise of forensic science and why it matters. Really going back to the 19th century, folks have recognized that forensic science has a tremendous potential. There's this great quotation of the darkened courtroom, the awed silence of the assembly, the intense mental strain on those most deeply interested, the awful force of the blow to the guilty man when he first beholds the evidence of his crime illumined by the light of scientific tests. This is from Percy Edwards in 1896. And for more than 100 years, the potential of forensic science to aid the criminal justice system has been recognized. There's also sort of an interesting way in which increasingly other systems, medicine, aviation, industrial processes, have really focused on viewing various processes as an overall system and on reducing error and making it as robust to human error as possible. And really focusing on the reliability. And James Doyle, for example, has argued for the application of this set of concepts to the criminal justice system to increase its reliability. And to do that, you have to abstract a bit and really view the criminal justice system as almost as an industrial process. It's really designed, diagnostic system, to really designed to identify certain categories of circumstances when a crime is committed by a particular person. And there are really sort of two particular types of errors that we worry about. One are wrongful convictions, and the other are unsolved cases. And this is obviously a key abstraction of the system, and there are lots of other constraints going on. But it's at least an important component of, and I think of almost any vision of the criminal justice system that we would want it to accomplish those tasks as reliably and as consistently as possible. And one of the great things about forensic science, right, is it's an additional source of information to classify these cases and a means to make the system more robust to inevitable human errors. It's a whole new area of potential information that can be gleaned about the world on top of sort of more conventional evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the like. So when you're thinking about trying to reduce errors in a system, what you really want are sort of uncorrelated errors. So you want systems that, and one of the advantages of forensic evidence, of course, is that hopefully it's objective and scientific as possible. Hopefully it's more reliable than eyewitness testimony or confessions or the like. It's independent of that other information. And the error should be uncorrelated with other errors. And in the sort of the accident reduction vocabulary, you're talking about loosely coupled systems, so that the process of forensic science can hopefully serve as a check, an independent check on other forms of evidence. Okay, I mean, it's important to recognize that there are some key assumptions here. Assumptions I'm not going to really go into today. First of all, obviously the evidence has to, in fact, be scientific. And a number of folks have commented that, at least in some cases, forensic science, or what's called forensic science, is not actually scientific. There are issues about peer review. There are issues about junk forensic science, or overstated results, poorly understood error rates. There are lab scandals, of course, where some people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there are reasons to quibble with that assumption. I'm not going to really talk about that today. But on the whole, at least in theory, there's considerable promise there. The other key assumption I am going to talk a little bit more about today is that the systems have to be loosely coupled. So errors are more likely to occur if systems are tightly coupled, and an error in one part of the system can sort of infect other parts of the system. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, that is a risk in the way we currently do forensic science. All right. So we wanted to know enough about the theory. How does it work in practice? The literature here is not, it's not huge. It's a little sparse, but it's pretty consistent. From Parker in 1963 found that it was used in less than 1% of cases. Rand did a study in the mid-1970s and found that it was used very little despite its availability in many, many cases. And Pearson more recently has found that, again, it's rarely used. But we wanted to do a study really trying to understand, well, that was a while ago. There's been a lot of funding that has gone into forensic laboratories. The DNA has revolutionized forensic science. How is it working now? So what did we do? Well, we did a fair amount. We did a mixed method study in 5 jurisdictions: Sacramento County, California, Sedgwick County, Kansas, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, Bexar County, Texas, and King County, Washington. In each of those jurisdictions, we did interviews with detectives, forensic labs, prosecutors, at sort of various levels of each institution. We collected a random sample of 1,000 reported crimes of various types, 200 of each type, in each jurisdiction with the hope that we'd be able to really measure the effect of different kinds of forensic science. We also conducted an analysis of national crime lab data using the Census of Publicly Funded Crime Laboratories from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from 2002, 2005, and 2009. And we conducted an experimental survey of prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys to understand the effect of forensic evidence on plea bargaining, which, of course, is where many of these cases get resolved. So the sort of first interesting thing we found was really when we began our interviews, we found that the development of forensic evidence wasn't really independent of the development of other evidence, and that actually the case status drove the analysis and the development of the forensic evidence. So it wasn't a situation where we could rely on sort of exogenous variation in the availability of different kinds of forensic evidence to then draw conclusions about how the case would progress. We heard again and again that if there was little other evidence, probably there was very little focus placed on either evidence collection or testing. But if the case was actually going to go to trial, there was a lot more analysis conducted. We also collected a fair amount of information about how often forensic evidence is collected and analyzed. And here you can see the numbers are probably a little bit small, but for folks to read. But in homicides, in all of our jurisdictions, they're collected fairly frequently and tested fairly frequently. But in rapes, aggravated assaults, robberies, and burglaries, there was less evidence collection and quite a bit less analysis and testing. And the other sort of takeaway that we thought was interesting was that there was, very little standardization. And that there were, apparently no sort of national best practices, even in large, fairly sophisticated departments. And, here you see, for example, that in robbery cases in San Antonio, they were collected in 15% of cases, compared to in Sacramento, you had 55% of cases. Some fairly stark differences in the amount of evidence that was, or the frequency with which evidence was collected. We also looked at what stage of analysis did the forensic analysis occur. And here we have, for all the cases, whether it's prior to, each of these figures represents the fraction of arrests, pleas, and trials that are preceded by requests for and completion of forensic analysis. Again, the story emerges that when there is testing and analysis, it tends to occur relatively late in the process. In very few cases did it occur prior to arrest. You can see by different category of analysis. And I should say, due to time, I'm really focusing more on our results today. The full workup of the papers is on the RAND website as a working paper. And I urge you to look at there if you're particularly interested in these results. So you can see that very, very low numbers prior to arrest, relatively low numbers prior to plea bargaining, and even prior to trial. The numbers of cases where there's actually testing occurs is pretty low. So the takeaways of this analysis is that the forensic evidence is rarely analyzed prior to an arrest. So detectives are not really using forensic evidence to identify suspects. It's often not analyzed until the eve of trial. And so the additional information advantage of forensic science that I talked about at the beginning isn't really being utilized. And the other sort of effect of this is it reduces the independence of forensic science if if potentially inconsistent results will lead to a lost case. And generally, when you're designing systems, you don't want to design a system with incentives along those lines. Okay, so why are things taking so long? Why is the testing pushed back? Well, one of the reasons is the analysis it takes a long time. Here we have the analysis time in days and for the different labs, and we can see that the times are quite lengthy, right? And what we're really talking about is for all of these labs, we're talking about, and for all these different kinds of interpretations, we're talking about months, not days. So it's very difficult to integrate forensic science into your investigative practice if the turnaround is going to take months. you can't exactly sort of, follow up a particular lead that way. So that's one of the problems. So why is the analysis occurring so late? Well, one, just the shortage of forensic lab resources requires triage. Partly mindset. Forensics are really viewed as a means of strengthening already strong cases. And one of the interesting things we learned in the interviews that was a bit disconcerting was that in a number of jurisdictions, the forensics were viewed as a way of meeting unrealistic jury expectations. And so there was no real hope that any probative evidence or information would come out of the process. It was just done to close off a defense argument from saying, "Oh, well, you didn't do the forensic testing here," and there was a real concern about juries having wildly unrealistic expectations and understandings of what forensic science could even potentially yield. So I guess the other part that I wanted to mention was that it sort of makes sense that if you have limited lab resources that and you have a limited number of cases, of course, going to trial as the cases triage out, that you want to put those resources into cases that are going to trial. But the problem with that system, of course, is that many of the theoretical advantages of forensic science, in terms of being an independent check that is uncorrelated with any other parts of the system and is a loosely coupled check, you lose many of those advantages. Yeah, so basically what I just said, comparative theory, it's rarely being used to identify suspects. It's rarely being used even in charging. And in rare cases where it's used at all, it's often being used to meet unrealistic jury expectations. And here it potentially creates incentives for misconduct of two kinds. One, there was some evidence of this, of disagreements about the importance of various pieces of forensic evidence when it didn't fit a very well-developed prosecution theory of the case, and when that evidence only is developed late in the process, that can be problematic. Similarly, there's pressure on prosecutors not to disclose that information to the defense if it potentially undermines the case. Now, I have no doubt that in the vast majority of cases, both the forensic examiners and the prosecutors are doing the right thing and disclosing the evidence appropriately. But again, from a systems design perspective, you don't want to have a system that at least creates perverse incentives like that. So we also did a experimental survey process where we tested our sort of assumptions about forensic evidence. I mean, maybe forensic evidence is just vastly overrated and it doesn't really matter. But we found, I hope unsurprisingly, that both prosecutors and defense counsel thought it mattered quite a bit. We presented various scenarios, hypothetical scenarios to a sample of prosecutors and a sample of defense counsel. Our findings were in accord with what one's expectations would be. The stronger the forensic evidence, the more likely the defense counsel would push their or recommend to their client that they accept a more severe sentence. Similarly, in the category of offers made, if the forensic science was stronger, the prosecutor would make more severe sentence offers. We also we looked at correlations between various categories of forensic science and outcomes, both in terms of plea bargaining outcomes and outcomes at trial. And certainly stronger forensic science was associated with convictions. And so we're a little hesitant about drawing strong causal conclusions there based on our interview findings, because we're a little concerned about reverse causality, because a number of people, again, said that the stronger the case, completely apart from the forensic evidence, the more likely the forensic evidence was to be even tested or developed. So the question was whether the independent strength of the case outside the forensic evidence was actually driving the strength of the forensic evidence, rather than what I think we had assumed going into this whole study, that it would be the other way around, that the strength of the forensic evidence would be driving the results. All right, we also looked at forensic lab efficiency, and again, using the Bureau of Justice Statistics census of labs. We found that fee-based laboratories generally have a higher productivity. These are laboratories that charge fees to law enforcement agencies to test. That sort of free market system might act as a sort of a effective and efficient means of triaging cases. And then similarly, the existence of a computerized laboratory management system also is associated with increased productivity. I have to say we were a little discouraged to find how rare those were, that they were far from universal. And that actually when we requested our data, it required a fair amount of manual work to extract the data that we needed. For both of these, we're a little bit reluctant to draw strong causal claims once again, because we have some concerns about potentially reverse causality or that there's something else that's going on here. But at least both of those factors were associated with higher lab throughput. All right, so our big takeaways here are that the theoretical promise of forensic science remains unrealized. And this is consistent with the literature for the last 50-odd years. The limited and late use of forensic evidence undermines some of the key theoretical benefits of the additional information and the independence. A quicker turnaround for a lot of these categories is probably a necessary condition for earlier and better use. And then, of course, the fee-based labs appear to have greater productivity. Overall, forensic science, I still think has enormous theoretical potential. It can be used to identify suspects in a wide range of offenses. But of course, in practice, it's rare outside homicide, and its use is almost always following arrest. In theory, it can be a truly independent verification of a suspect's guilt or innocence. In practice, however, we found the labs typically work pretty closely with law enforcement and often knew in advance what detectives and prosecutors were hoping to prove. In theory, charging decisions are affected by the availability of forensic evidence, but in practice, prosecutors often did not have the results at the time of charging. In theory, jurors correctly understand the probative weight of forensic evidence and its limitations and reasons for its absence, but in practice, prosecutors and law enforcement believe that jurors harbor unrealistic beliefs about it, and that testing is often conducted to address these unrealistic beliefs rather than to actually generate probative evidence. Rather than forensic science shaping the subsequent investigation, we often found that the forensic evidence is often tested if prosecutors and investigators believe they already have an otherwise strong case. While this form of triage may be understandable given the scarcity of limited forensic resources, the absence of the testing in the investigating stage can lead to problems. And it can also put pressure on both forensic science personnel and prosecutors in a way that's not helpful. A bunch of other professions and industries, from manufacturing to aviation and medicine, have really focused on designing systems with these independent decoupled processes to reduce the chance that the inevitable human lapse will lead to a grave error in the outcome of the system. Decoupling reduces the interdependency of the system and the effect of a single mistake in the outcome of the system. Forensic science has the potential to be such an independent process for the criminal justice system, and reduce both unsolved crimes and wrongful convictions. But the use of forensic science that we documented, unfortunately, uneven and generally late in the criminal justice process, is not able to fill that promise. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, James, for your presentation. I think what I'm going to talk about today sort of builds on some of those themes with a focus more on sexual assault kits and sexual assault kit processing. Some of the challenges that we've seen in the field, but also opportunities to increase how law enforcement and crime laboratories work on this challenging process. So as many of you know, this issue of unsubmitted and untested sexual assault kits has been a major issue for multiple decades, especially over the last decade. Has received a good amount of attention in the media and has received a good amount of funding from entities like NIJ and BJA. Sexual assault kits, I'm sure many of you are familiar with what these are, but it's a set of items used and collected by medical personnel from the victim survivor for the preservation of physical evidence following a sexual assault report. And it's also done as a source of medical care to the victim survivor. So extremely important both for the survivor's perspective, but also from the perspective of public safety. So unsubmitted kits, just in terms of terminology, I'm using the term unsubmitted kit SAKs, sexual assault kits, are those that accrue in law enforcement agencies, and those are ones that may sit in evidence rooms or other places in an agency. And then untested kits are those pending analysis in crime laboratories. So why is this issue important, especially from the issue of unsubmitted, but also delays in testing? And how do we go about sort of arriving at this problem, which is I would say that there are really examples of success and promise, but also it's a huge challenge, especially as the amount and the demand for evidence, for DNA evidence in particular, has risen across the country. One is DNA testing has not existed forever, as we all know, and in some cases, colder cases, obviously DNA testing was not available. And as part of that, it's also taken part of the system sort of catch up, particularly on the law enforcement side, to the understanding of the benefits of DNA testing. And at this point, testing as early in the process as possible. There was also limited policies in the past regarding sexual assault kit submission and testing, and funding was a major issue. In past work, we found that sometimes law enforcement was hesitant to submit a sexual assault kit to the crime laboratory because they were concerned about the resources the crime lab had, and maybe they saw that in past experiences. There was also, in some cases, unclear benefits to the investigation. Maybe it was consensual or reported consensual crime by the part of the suspect, and so unclear benefits in terms of what the analyzing the sexual assault kit would provide. Staffing is a major issue. It continues to be, and it'll be a big theme of what I'm talking about today. Insufficient staffing to investigate and prosecute cases, and also insufficient staffing on the crime laboratory side. And also areas of victim blaming and misinterpreting signs of trauma, the idea of trauma-informed training, trauma-informed understanding about how victim survivors react differently as a result of trauma. So before jumping into the NIJ research project, I did want to talk about the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, which is led by BJA, and some of the opportunities that's presented since FY15 and sort of really transforming what the area of not only reducing backlog on submitted sexual assault kits, but also addressing the systemic needs to sort of better link the system in terms of testing those kits, investigating those crimes, and prosecuting them, and also all within a context of victim engagement and support. So SAKI has grown tremendously since FY15, and currently there's 71 SAKI grantee sites. As you can see, there are 25. Those are statewide sites, and then associated of other types of jurisdictional setups. A large amount of funding has been provided to that, and RTI is fortunate enough to be a part of that in terms of working with local agencies towards addressing their goals. They also, every site has to inventory all their unsubmitted kits and have a testing plan for handling them. So what is the national impact of SAKI been to date? Well, as I mentioned, this inventory of unsubmitted sexual assault kits, conducting investigative case reviews associated with each kit, a testing plan, which sometimes means working with a private laboratory to outsource some or all those kits, sexual assault kit tracking, and also effective communication engagement with victim survivors. So a few examples of metrics across the SAKI sites as of June 2020, and a few that I just wanted to call your attention to. One, over 130,000 previously unsubmitted sexual assault kits have been inventoried to date by these state and local jurisdictions. Many of these, more than half, have been sent for testing. And then another key metric here, over 23,000 CODIS uploads into the system with 11,000 CODIS hits. And many of those have led to subsequent investigations. So really it's an active way of sort of engaging and providing staffing resources and other resources to these jurisdictions in need. So why is it so important to submit and test sexual assault kits in a comprehensive manner? Well, one, violent offenders, what we've learned, especially over the last 5+ years, about the nature of violent offending, sexual assault offending, crossover offending is significant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Justice for victims, holding offenders accountable, but also this issue of populating the CODIS system. It's really only as effective as are the cases in CODIS. And the research that's come out of that. What we know now about serial offending through sources like CODIS, crossover offending in terms of crossover offenders that don't just target strangers, that really target multiple types of victims in their path, and also learning more about the reasons why SACs have not been submitted or tested. So just a few examples in terms of serial crossover and serial offending. Serial offending is much more common, I think, than was previously known, and this is based on a study in Cuyahoga County, but also similar work has been done in places like Detroit, Kansas, and other jurisdictions. And another key point here is that most serial offenders do not appear to consistently stick to a certain type of victim. Often they're targeting acquaintances, family members, children, strangers, sometimes campus victims on a campus. So we should sort of move away from this idea that we should have policies based on strangers versus non-strangers, because all these things fit together. Another important point is the idea that that we should prioritize necessarily kids associated with stranger crimes versus non-stranger. In part because I think we've learned a tremendous amount in terms of the value of testing those acquaintance or non-stranger kids, and also the idea of linking cases, including offenders that target those victims known to them. So with that, I will move into. Okay, so let me talk a little bit. I'm going to move now to the NIJ project that was conducted several years back. So the focus of this project was really trying to develop more of a quantitative approach towards looking at sexual assault kit processing efficiency. And there's certainly been some great work done in this area of sort of taking economic models and applying them to criminal justice systems, including the work done at West Virginia by Paul Speaker and others, including the folks at RAND. So one of the key focuses of this study is to really look at how can we identify and contextualize the types of factors that contribute to backlogs on the law enforcement side and also untested kits in forensic crime laboratories. And perhaps most importantly, can we identify and provide research-informed guidance that help agencies move kits effectively through the process? We are focused here on sort of the law enforcement and crime laboratory perspective. I'll talk a little bit about the prosecution perspective, but the quantitative analysis is really focused on law enforcement and prosecution. So again, it's the NIJ funded project, determines specific policies, characteristics of jurisdictions, including resource inputs, staffing, technology and equipment, and then also other factors in terms of the characteristics of those agencies or laboratories. And the idea, again, is to create more of a research-informed framework that ideally can benefit practitioners out there for guiding what they advocate for and how they utilize both internal and external resources. So this is a mixed method study. I'm really going to be focused on phases 1 and 2. But just to kind of review a little bit the methods here, we surveyed all forensic, state and local forensic laboratories that conduct biological analysis, DNA analysis. We had 145 responses of those, and then a linked sample of law enforcement agencies associated with those crime laboratories. That was for the design. Also, in the third phase, we conducted site visits to 6 of those jurisdictions, including conducting interviews with crime laboratory personnel, law enforcement, and prosecution. Again, I'm really going to focus mainly on phases 1 and 2, although I'll talk a little about some of the things we learned from phase 3. So what are some of the key findings? And I won't get too much into the analysis framework here, but we did use an economic statistical process called statistical frontier models to estimate the production or cost functions of these inputs and outputs. And one of the explicit goals is to account for the existence of inefficiency in the process. So a larger question is, to what extent are are inefficiencies in the process affecting maybe the inability for law enforcement to process and submit kits and for crime labs to test them versus how much of it is dependent on resources. As might be expected, we're finding that there was really a combination of those technical inefficiencies and lack of resources that is impacting efficiency. But one of the key findings is that even if for law enforcement agencies, even if all agency resources, so staff, equipment, other types of policies in place were used to their fullest potential, about 75% of law enforcement agencies would still have an operating backlog. This is key for several reasons. One, in that it really demonstrates that we cannot really adequately address and overcome this issue without investing in staffing and without investing in policies. And I'll come back to that a little bit more. Put a little bit differently, law enforcement would only be able to submit under about 60% of all sexual assault kits, given their maximum use of resources. So for crime laboratories, a little bit different picture, but also demonstrating the huge need to address the lack of resources. So even if all laboratory resources were used to their fullest potential, maximizing their efficiency, 50%, so half of state and local laboratories would still have an operating testing backlog. One of the other things we learned is that to relate to my point I was just making is that jurisdictions cannot create a sustainable sexual assault kit processing process or plan without investing in staff. This is one of the first studies to really quantify the impact of staffing on these sexual assault kit processing. When I'm saying processing, I'm including law enforcement and crime labs and those outputs. So as an example, the key of law enforcement staff, and one issue here, just so folks know, we're looking at total staff for law enforcement agencies, which I recognize is a little bit of more of an aggregate measure, but still the importance of staffing is huge. 25%, so a 25% increase in staffing, or a 25% increase in processing would from 100% increase in the number of full-time sworn officers, and for crime laboratories, the number of SACs tested increased by about 43%. For 100% increase in analysts. And I realize those are large increases in staffing, but they demonstrate that we can't overcome this issue without addressing it. The other outcome that's, I think, really important to point to is the importance of policies. I know many agencies are actively implementing policies. This data is about 5 years data, about 5 years dated, I should say. So we were able to look at how many crime labs had a test all submission policy, for example, and similarly on the laboratory side, some of the specific policies they had in place. And I think the bottom line here is policies matter. It may be sort of common sense, but law enforcement agencies with 100% submission policies are more efficient, but also the higher number of formal policies in place increased sufficient efficiency outcomes for law enforcement agencies. And so this is not to say that is the only way to address this problem, but I think it shows that having a structured way that the law enforcement agency and those operating with them understand what's happening with regard to how they process kits is extremely important. Similarly, for crime laboratory, evidence acceptance policies, other types of policies associated with for example, a SAC-only analysis where they would prioritize the sexual assault kit and not the other evidence, including bedding, only if they had a negative test on the SAC. Those are important factors at increasing efficiency outputs. So what are some of the recommendations coming out of this? And I should mention we have 2 articles in press, and I'll get to those in the following slide where you can get a lot more detail in terms of the specific models and results and the implications. One, of course, is we need to invest in staff hiring and retention. And part of that is not only the idea of increased staffing, but also it's the idea of qualified and trained staffing and looking at the issue of staff sustainability. So one of the things that came up in the interviews we did is health and wellness, and also the idea of making sure that burnout is addressed. And that came up particularly on the laboratory side. but equally on the law enforcement side. We've done a lot of work on the SACI project looking at sexual assault units and those types of arrangements and how those are organized. And I think there's a lot of innovation that is occurring, but that could increasingly occur to not only address staffing, but look at how we staff a sexual assault unit, including add in civilian staffs, for example, a forensic technician that helps track forensic evidence as it moves in and back to the agency. A related recommendation is developing a system-wide process map. So not thinking about these things as silos, which we hear a lot about moving away from silos. Well, we have to put that in action in terms of developing a system-wide process map that looks at how things link together and even developing sort of jurisdictional or system-wide outcomes and metrics that can hold each other accountable, but also demonstrate that all these entities, law enforcement, a crime lab, prosecution, victim services are all linked together, including the sexual assault nurses. And finally, developing interagency multidisciplinary policies. Our study has demonstrated the importance of policy and also shown the ones that at least we found to be most effective. But I think moving forward, we should look at how do we create policies that are sort of cross-disciplinary? How do we engage the sexual assault response team or the MDT as these policies are created, and also get their buy-in before they're finalized? So with that, this might be a little small, but the two articles I mentioned, one is in Criminal Justice Policy Review, and then the other is in the Journal of Forensic Science, and my contact information is there. So happy to address any questions at the end, or please contact me directly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin, very much. I am really excited to speak to you guys today about the impact of research and technology dissemination through the FTCOE. So the obligatory disclaimer slide, this is my own opinion and does not necessarily reflect the U.S. government or Department of Justice opinion. So I just wanted to give a quick overview about what the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence is. It is a program, a cooperative agreement of the National Institute of Justice, and it does sit in the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences. So it does sit with Jonathan McGrath, who will discuss some other programs shortly. It was instituted in 2007, and it has been administered by RTI International since 2011. And in this time, the FTCOE, since 2007 actually, has reached tens of thousands of criminal justice practitioners by providing unbiased dissemination and evaluation of forensic technologies to include best practices and policies. It is, at RTI, we have a team of scientists and multimedia specialists that help support the FTCOE, along with a robust list of partners that we work with, around 16 or 17 or so, 13 of which are CPAC universities that also help provide a lot of our activities and analysis across the board. It is managed by Dr. Jerry Ropero Miller, our current American Academy of Forensic Sciences president, and it is co-led by myself, Danya Slack. I am a research forensic scientist, and also Nicole Jones, who also is a research scientist at RTI. So in general, the FTCOE has 5 overarching goals. We provide scientific and technical support to the NIJ research portfolio. We facilitate demonstration and transfer and adoption of technologies into any pertinent stakeholder. And we also provide technology assistance beyond the crime laboratories and into other appropriate criminal justice agencies, to include law enforcement agencies. And we also provide and develop access to resources for research and education, training, best practices all across the criminal justice community. And then the 5th one, which I'll focus on today, is that we help to develop and implement strategic plans to evaluate the impact of forensic science funding across the entire criminal justice system. So we do this essentially in 3 different ways. We call them our pillars. We do this by advancing technology, sharing knowledge, and addressing challenges. And each one of those basically are just different ways that we do our outreach to the community. We work with practitioners and researchers. We help with the R&D portfolio that NIJ funds every single year. And then we also provide webinars and a lot of outreach and dissemination products across the board in our Sharing Knowledge pillar. So obviously this is a little bit of an eye chart there, but I just wanted to show that, you know, every year we look at our impact across the criminal justice system and how many people and different organizations that we're reaching. And this was some of the metrics that we pulled from last calendar year. We were due to do that again by the end of next month. But we have thousands of people that we reach either through our podcast, Just Science, or through different webinar attendance that we host in person and now virtual, a lot of virtual symposia and forums. And we also host working groups across the board, whether that's for law enforcement or for crime lab practitioners. We're a community resource, really. So I wanted to go over a handful of different projects that the FTCOE has been involved in for the past several years that show some of this return on investment in NIJ and government funds. So with that, I wanted to take the presentation kind of like from start to finish of, you know, investing in funds from the very beginning, whether that's, you know, investing in an actual building design all the way through what does that look like for management and being able to look at, you know, how personnel and full-time equivalents actually are functioning in a productive laboratory. So the first project that I want to discuss is our lean facility design project that we worked on a couple of years ago. So in 2013, NIST actually published the White Book on forensic science labs. It's basically a handbook to help laboratories plan and design the construction of efficient laboratories. And so the FTCOE was able to put some funding into the evaluation of the impact of being able to follow this type of process. So this is looking at a lean facility design, and as you can see on the right there, there's a checklist that's included in that White Book. We worked with the Midwest Forensics Resource Center, formerly the Ames Laboratory, and also the Brazos Group to help implement these guides and the process map for one agency. So we worked with the Broward County Sheriff's Office to go work with them through the checklist and through the process map to do an assessment of their own facility to see where are some of the gaps and where could there be some process improvement. So we went through the lean facility needs assessment methodology, starting off with situational analysis, looking at what is their current state of practice, then working through, well, what could an ideal state of operation be? And then closing the loop, basically, meaning, you know, where were some of the gaps? What would be the ideal way for this, the structural architecture to actually be most efficient? So we completed this analysis, and the results indicated that the Broward Sheriff's Office actually did need to expand into a larger space. And so what was great about this project is that through this analysis and through this investment, they were able to work with their leadership to start receiving bids to be able to start procuring architectural bids so that they could grow out the laboratories and they could implement the plan as stated by this lean facility design analysis. But yeah, in the short term, what also came about was that they showed that they needed to switch to some more cloud-based options to implement on their current programs. They also noted that there were some interagency communication gaps, so they were able to improve that. And then they also noticed that there were some bottlenecks that what they needed to do was just actually implement a couple more management positions and promote a couple of positions so that those bottlenecks could be reduced. The next project I want to talk about is one on advancing DNA efficiencies through working on Lean Six Sigma principles. So we work very closely with West Virginia University, their College of Business and Economics. And so on this project, we actually, we knew that they had this course teaching Lean Six Sigma and certifying forensic professionals specifically in as green belts. And it was a course that was taught for 3 years in a row. and it was taught by Tim Cooperschmidt of the NYOCME, who he himself is a Lean Six Sigma black belt. So the courses that they taught included forensic professionals from all over the country, and the requirement was they were supposed to try to find a tangible project that they would be able to take from start to finish. And through that, the FDCOE decided to follow the cohorts of different classes to determine, well, what was the return on investment of being able to implement these Lean Six theories and principles in their own laboratory. So there was a slew of different projects. These are some examples on the left of some of the projects that were funded or that were implemented throughout the process. And the one I wanted to talk about was this decreased turnaround time in DNA analysis. So we worked with our social science specialist, Dr. Kelly Barrick, to be able to do both qualitative and quantitative analysis on how these programs were implemented. And we asked the basic program evaluation questions of, was the project actually implemented? What were the unintended and intended outcomes? And what was the leadership response? And what kind of challenges? And then actually looking at some quantitative data as well to see was there a tangible return on that investment. So the project that was implemented for advancing DNA efficiencies was actually the West Virginia State Police Crime Laboratory. And so they were interested in reducing their turnaround time for DNA analysis. So the laboratory had two separate units, the serology unit and the DNA unit. And through the Lean Six Sigma principle of define, measure, analyze, improve, and control, they were able to find some areas for tangible change to be able to implement some more efficient processes. So some of the changes that they made were they were able to direct sample transfer straight from serology to the DNA section. They implemented a regular huddle meeting so that they could improve communication across the units. They moved to a paperless case file process as well. And then one of the big ones that they found was that they had a lot of active cases, but they saw that there could be an efficient way to outsource certain ones and still be able to maintain an efficient workflow for themselves. And with that, they noted that there were 3 additional positions that if they just added these full-time equivalents, then their processes would actually increase. So the quantitative results from this study, after year 1, they saw a 17% reduction in turnaround time. And after year 2, they actually saw that that increased to 48%. And then when they looked at all of the active cases that they needed to outsource, they decided to outsource all of their sexual assault kits, and that increased the efficiency as well. They halted on some unnecessary tasks, and then they began tracking trends so that they could perform their own change management, and they could do their own lessons learned so that they could implement this across the board and for other units. And so because of the success of the DNA efficiency program that they did through Lean Six, they were able to move on to doing similar processes in other units like their drug identification section. The next project is another one that is also advancing a DNA unit efficiency. So this was an interesting project because this was an evaluation of the impact of the DNA efficiency improvement grant programs. So in 2009, the NIJ released a solicitation to specifically help forensic DNA efficiency or units improve their efficiency. And one of the grantees that was awarded a project was the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, and they were able to get funding, and this is one of these really good examples of where cost sharing kind of comes into play because they also put up some of their own funding. They wanted to perform or they wanted to actually enhance their efficiency. So, and I wanted to put a little plug here that this is an open access FSI Synergy article that you guys can download for the full study. But this was a project implemented, you see the milestone there in 2009, and then you don't see a lot of the impact realized until a little bit later on. So in 2009, Palm Beach, their forensic biology unit, wanted to respond to some of the concerns of their three surrounding law enforcement agencies regarding their turnaround time. They were basically getting complaints that the turnaround time was not adequate. And so they did apply for this funding so that they could develop they could develop a biological processing lab. And this was a pre-screening laboratory that would be managed by a city police agency, and it would be completely independent of the crime lab itself. And so this was interesting because it serviced the three surrounding law enforcement agencies and allowed crime scene evidence to be pre-screened at this location before moving on to the crime lab or the forensic biology unit. And what's interesting that this was actually put in place as a fee-for-service type of, it was a fee for services. So, each one of the three law enforcement agencies actually had to help fund this pre-screening crime lab or department. So their project actually completed in 2012, and RTI was interested in this project from a different project that RTI had where we were analyzing the impact of forensic DNA efficiency programs. And so we saw that when we completed our project around the same time, around 2012, that we weren't seeing a very big return on investment. However, we stayed in touch with Cecilia Kraus, the crime lab director there, and we knew that there were some return on investments that were being realized. So the FTCOE was funded to be able to do a more in-depth analysis several years later. So in 2018, we went back and we decided to take a look at all of the efficiencies that might have happened between 2012 and 2018 when their project ended to current status. And so when we did an analysis, the one thing I wanted to really bring attention to is that we saw an increase in law enforcement agency and the crime lab communication. So that was really important because before there was a little bit of contention on the turnaround time, and now because they were working as a multidisciplinary unit, they had a better communication strategy going forward. But beyond that, we actually saw some pretty impactful quantitative results. There were 27% turnaround time reduction, a 9% decrease in analyst caseload, 88% decrease in the DNA backlog that they had, 54% increase in non-suspect cases, and then also an 8% increase in CODIS entries. So one of the things I wanted to really call your attention to here is the lesson learned for doing evaluations like this is that laboratories do require time to fully implement a process before a thorough evaluation can be completed. So even if you're looking at the end of a grant period, you might not see an immediate return on investment, but when processes are put into place, you can see a more tangible return on investment as the years go on. And then the last one I wanted to talk about in this DNA world here is, those were crime labs and even a partnership with law enforcement. But this one was one where we really do try to target anyone who uses a forensic technology. So in 2017, Richland County of South Carolina expressed a desire to expand their ongoing rapid DNA program, and they wanted to put it into the booking environment because they knew that that's where the FBI was heading, especially with some of their pilot programs that came a little bit later on. And so we helped to support the validation and proof of concept study of a rapid hit ID placed in one of their detention centers. So the real impact of this study was showing that the study showed that rapid DNA instruments could produce a DNA profile meeting QAS requirements for CODIS, that non-scientists are able to operate these instruments. And, they were able to show a small yet still powerful return on that investment in that 69 profiles were uploaded in CODIS, and it generated even 3 CODIS hits. And a publication did arise from this as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the foresight work that we work on with our partner at West Virginia University, Dr. Paul Speaker. So Project Foresight is a business-oriented self-evaluation tool that allows lab managers to analyze their productivity and their performance and then actually compare themselves against other similar size or similar in function labs. And so this has been developed and it has been managed by Dr. Paul Speaker at West Virginia University since 2008. It's ongoing. And it allows a synthesis of operational opportunities so that lab managers understand where they might need to improve budget, personnel, lab management. And he does this by looking at 7 key performance areas, including cost, productivity, turnaround time, backlog. So one of the evaluations that the FTCOE did was to determine what was the real return on investment from processing backlogs of untested facts. And I think this is a nice follow-on to even the work that Kevin just presented. And so the FTCOE and West Virginia University, we evaluated, or Paul Speaker evaluated that return on investment at a jurisdictional level. So what is the real net benefit to society relative to that investment? So that includes even things like victim services, and that includes even case closure or even pulling violent offenders off of the street. And so previous cost-benefit analyses showed, would just look at maybe just numbers, that the cost range per kit might be anywhere between $23 and $980. But what's great about Foresight is that it does control for an economies of scale. So for smaller jurisdictions, a cost expenditure might be $1,842, even at $980 a kit. But regardless of those expenditures, the return on investment for even those labs is still above a 5,000% return on investment. And when you're looking at a perfect economies of scale, when you have a certain size jurisdiction, if they're able to process somewhere around 6,200 cases per year, the return on the societal investment is somewhere around 64,000. Of course, the mean is somewhere around, or maybe the median is closer to between 9,000 and 12,000. But either way, these are really tangible returns on investment for things like reducing the backlog. Same with the opioid crisis. So we all know that, current financial considerations are showing that there is a severe underestimation on what has been happening in this opioid crisis and how it has impacted the system. So the cost of the criminal justice system at this point has been estimated around $8 billion, with $270 million of that actually being borne by crime labs. So Foresight data actually looked at different analytical processes to see, well, what is specifically, how is this looking, especially in the crisis states, and comparing those to the national norm. And so even with the projected 3% annual rate increase, which is across the board, across all forensic disciplines, it was shown that in the crisis states, you're getting way more expenditures than what was ever planned for. So what's great about these types of studies is that this allows jurisdictions to go to Congress and ask for additional funds. This is a tangible return on that type of analysis. And this is, again, another open access FSI synergy paper that you can read. And again, so we worked with Paul Speaker to determine, well, what is the best way to optimize a sustainable workforce. So right now we're in year 3 of working on a workforce calculator. And I just wanted to put a plug out there. We would like as much data as possible to make sure that we are basing it on reality. But there's a calculator, it's housed on the FTCOE website, where you can enter in the type of jurisdiction that you have, whether it's large or small, different crime rates for violent and property crime, and the population served to determine what would be the optimal FTEs per unit that would be needed to address the casework load. So please check that out, and if at all possible, if you're able to share your data back with Dr. Speaker, that would be ideal. And so a couple of just plugs of things that we know are of importance in the community, one of which is our workforce resiliency endeavors. We have, at this point, 7 archived webinars, one of which is an OVC toolkit, which I think is a fantastic resource that can be used by forensic professionals as well. Also, there was a recent study funded by the NIJ on a survey of what is the real impact to crime labs on things like stress, burnout, vicarious trauma. We have a couple of podcasts, one on how leadership can be applied in crime scene investigators, and then also building workforce resiliency. And then this is a new paper that just came out last month. It's a literature review that I wrote on some of the trauma and coping mechanisms that has been exhibited across the forensic science community. So that just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's open access again. And then another challenge that we know the community is facing is how are we actually presenting evidence, and is it being understood? And are jurors understanding a lot of this evidence? It's hard enough for forensic scientists and even the court system to understand a lot of the statistics that's going on now. But what is the real juror's perception on how they're understanding forensic evidence? So we have a podcast on that, and we also have a really great gap analysis and lit review on the comprehension of jurors, and that's, again, FSI Synergy. And then just to close it out, we do have other impact evaluations coming, looking more in the drug realm. We're looking at the FIDO programs, mobile drug testing to aid in substance abuse response. And that one's really interesting because this is one that just came about during the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of the lessons learned, we're learning that can actually be shared for smaller jurisdictions that might not have a lot of funding. So we're doing an analysis of what that looks like. We're also doing a few cost-benefit analysis, one on outsourcing for medical examiners and coroners. What is the return on investment for doing a straight direct-to-DNA? And then also, what is the return on investment for reducing turnaround time for DUID cases? Oops. And then we have a couple of reports coming out, one on lawfully owed, some of the challenges of CODIS database not having all of the samples from convicted or arrestee offenders that should be in there, and what does that look like, and presenting some use case and some lessons learned. And then, of course, the forensic genetic genealogy is a big thing right now. So pulling together some of the information on what are the differences in the technology, what does this mean concerning third-party doctrine when it comes to databases like GEDmatch, and then what are some of the best practices in working in collaboration between law enforcement and crime labs. And then we've got some great podcasts coming out, some case studies where forensic technologies have been of impact, actual training on using forensic radiology for autopsies, and then a couple of apps. And then I always like to give a plug out for the NIJ's R&D Symposium and poster session. It's going to be a pretty great one this year. It's virtual, and it'll be in February, as it always surrounds apps. And then just a last plug, we can't do this without the community. We are completely indebted to all of the researchers and practitioners that do reach out to us and try to bridge the gap. And so, see our webpage where we do try to team together researchers and practitioners, also through the NCJRS website and through ASCLD LEAP program. So if there are areas in which you feel like you would like an evaluation, or you think that there is a way that the FTCOE can help with any of these impacts, just reach out. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Danya. Now, John and I are going to kind of do a quick wrap up, provide some closing remarks on the state of the social science research and forensic science portfolio. John's going to lead that off, and then I will facilitate the Q&A after that.
All right, Eric, so let me scroll to the top of the slide deck here. Sorry about putting it back into the front. So I'm Jonathan McGrath, and I want to thank each of our panelists here. Eric, can you hear me okay and see the slides? All right, looks good. Okay. So yeah, I just want to thank each of our speakers, Danya, Kevin, and James. This is really great information. I think it demonstrates the breadth of what NIJ has been able to accomplish in the last 10 years or so. And so Eric and I wanted to discuss kind of where things have been with this social science research and forensic science portfolio that NIJ has been building. In particular, Eric's going to kind of run through some of the activities that have occurred when the program launched in approximately 2005 through the activities that went to 2015. And then I'll touch upon several of the current updates and trends over the past 5 years and current activities that NIJ is focusing on. But I kind of thought of some fun facts as Danya and James and Kevin were talking too. I'm going to scroll to the next slide. So I sit within OIFS, or the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences. And so we're the lead federal agency for forensic science research and development. And so our office provides short and long-term resources, both to develop forensic science research in the physical science area in the STEM fields,
but then also to translate that research into practice, as Danya mentioned. So I can't thank Danya and the FTCOE enough. They've done some wonderful work transitioning these products from the research world. And so one of the fun facts that Danya didn't mention, but alludes to one of the things that James's talking points was the implementation of LIMS systems, or Laboratory Information Management Systems. And the BGS survey, that the most recent one that was conducted, and they're finishing up their current iteration of the survey, Census Survey of Crime Laboratories. But based on data from 2014, 9 out of every 10 laboratories had implemented a LIMS system, and the FTCOE recently provided a landscape report on LIMS systems. So I encourage you, if you're interested or want to find out more information about the types of information that's collected and developed in laboratories, or interested in understanding how to tap into that information and to develop your own LIMS systems, there's a great amount of detail in that report that just came out. So I'll try to throw a link in the chat box. And then also, when we discuss about testing all for sexual assault kits, there's a number of studies that have come out that have complemented Kevin's work based out of Stanford University. I think Paul Speaker and Jen Doliak have done some work on sexual assault kit return on investments. And really the research is showing that testing all kits is the best policy. It really is something that NIJ has looked at for several years now and has been incorporated into the recent DNA funding opportunities over the last 3 years that our Office of Justice Programs has provided. So that there's actually a secondary allotment of funding for states that have legislation on the books to do test-to-all kit policies within their jurisdictions. So Bureau of Justice Assistance now handles that grant program, the Capacity Enhancement and Backlog Reduction Program for DNA. So I encourage you to look at these things. We're definitely taking all this information in and helping develop our policies and practices accordingly as well. So on this note, I certainly invite you as collaborators from both social science and physical science fields. I've had a great relationship with Eric Martin and his office to develop and bridge the gap between the social science researchers and forensic science researchers, and we look forward to additional partnerships. So I'll turn the slide deck over to Eric for the next few slides, and he'll talk about his office as well. Give me 1 second, Eric, and I'll toss
the presenter
role to you.
So before I start cycling through my slides, I'm going to give just a brief overview of where I sit at NIJ, what we're about, and then present just a very high-level review of the social science research and forensic science portfolio. And, you know, of course, everybody we talk to belong to that portfolio as well. So I'm going to pretty much summarize findings, kind of generalized across a number of different studies, just kind of give you a picture of where we're at. And I'm sure there are many other researchers who partnered with us in the portfolio. Some may be on the call. And, you know, I'm not trying to pick out, cherry pick certain studies, just kind of finding ones that go together. But before I get to that, little segue, I am a social science analyst in the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Technology. John's counterpart agent office at NIJ. And what we do, we're kind of a combination of social scientists and engineers, if, you know, in kind of broad strokes in that lens. We handle a number of program evaluations of policy and practice. We also have a very robust technology standards division and developing technological solutions to current criminal justice challenges. And then we also have social scientists who look at, you know, the causes and correlates of crime, offending, and juvenile delinquency. So we're pretty, we have a broad stroke here at NIJ, and we also support the entire criminal justice system. We deal with policing, corrections, courts, administration of justice, certain special topics like wrongful conviction. And John, at the end of our mini presentation, is going to get to how research for SSRFS has continued on in support of some of these other portfolios. So now, just again, a very high-level history of what we've done and where we're going. kind of going all the way back to 2005, one of the founding analysts from NIJ, who's no longer with NIJ, she's at BJ, Kathy Browning, really started to work with others, Nancy Ritter, Jim Doyle as well, at the agency, looking at forensic science as a discipline. And forensic science, if you can imagine, back in 2005 was starting to become very popular around the country. There was a realization of forensic science, what it was doing. And although James said, you know, it has its roots back into the 19th century, DNA analysis didn't become pretty much on the scene till the late 1980s, early 90s, and then it started to proliferate at that time. And so there was a sense of, we have this, we know what this is, we know what it's supposed to do, but we haven't really, we don't have a body of knowledge and program evaluations of how forensic science contributes to the criminal justice system, primarily in arrests and prosecutions. And one thing that Kathy's stewardship of the portfolio was really instrumental in, from an NIJ perspective, was kind of bridging the gaps. Forensic scientists and social scientists usually are totally different departments in the academy. They may not speak the same language. They may not even really associate with each other. So a lot of those early years was holding working groups, holding workshops and seminars, bringing the best and brightest of both fields together so that they can learn from each other and see what are the pressing issues in forensic science, how do we study that from a social science perspective. And one of the interesting things that Kathy imparted in the report that I have up on the slide was, you know, social scientists often brought the right method to analyze efficiencies, but they weren't policy relevant. And forensic scientists, of course, are policy relevant because they knew the problems. They were dealing with the issues, but they needed assistance as far as a lot of the method to do the analysis. So a lot of that first, what we call wave one, was building that groundwork. And then we get in wave two to some of the emerging issues that were becoming very big at the time, particularly DNA sexual assault backlogs. NIJ kicked off a number of action research projects, notably in Detroit and Houston, and also Los Angeles. And we also started to support, through the portfolio, other like-minded research topics where they started to kind of blend together. There was a lot of work at NIJ at the time in eyewitness testimony. And that's one thing where the regular policing researchers and the SSRFS analysts really complemented each other as well. There was kind of this growing support at NIJ among investigations and generating evidence, and also, you know, acknowledging some of the issues with investigations and how to correct them. Although it came on much later, this is where you started to get some of the groundwork for the Sentinel Events Initiative, kind of growing out of a lot of these questions. So one portfolio kind of went to another portfolio, went to another portfolio, and we have a whole groundswell of different topics that are very much interconnected at NIJ right now. And then wave three, it was building on some of those early findings. You started to see like one project funded in 2005, 2006, a couple maybe in 2007, and those findings were starting to come in, and there was two major things that happened at this time. One, NIJ hosted a seminar of the researchers that had participated in the portfolio to date at that time to kind of take stock of what we know, where we are, and how to move forward. And then also the National Academy of Sciences issued their report for strengthening forensic science in the United States. And the NAS report had a number of different recommendations for how to strengthen forensic science. And NIJ, we ended up, through our collaborations with researchers, really kind of focusing on three. Although, you know, if you go back, and the report is still available, if you Google it, you'll be taken to the National Criminal Justice Data Archive, and you can pull the report from there. And then you'll see it's like a 300-page report. There's a number of excellent recommendations in there, but through our work with our researchers in our portfolio, we really kind of hammered on 3, improving investigations and how forensics can really assist investigations and not just come in, as we already discussed, later in the criminal justice process, kind of assisting plea bargains and making stronger cases for conviction. Can forensic science reduce wrongful conviction? Can we eliminate those sources of criminal justice error? And then also, how do we have jurors understand the potential and limits of forensic analysis when it comes to providing probative evidence in a case? And you can see we're talking about wave 3, a very delineated time at NIJ. We call it 2010, 2013, but these topics are still being researched at NIJ. We still keep coming back to it, and a lot of what was already presented in our presentation speaks to that. So briefly, again, I alluded to, we had this seminar. It was in early 2013, and we really wanted to kind of take stock of what we've been learning, where we want to go. We had done a number of different projects on DNA analysis, how DNA is used in court and in criminal investigations, how labs process DNA evidence, how backlogs can occur, how best to rectify those. And there was kind of what was interesting. I was at the meeting at the time. It was really interesting to hear from the social science researchers who were at the meeting. And there was just kind of a growing awareness that we really needed to move the portfolio beyond just DNA to look at the potential and, you know, go through the same efficiency trials and seeing how these different forensic methods support investigations and prosecutions. So we delineated 3 different types of forensic methods that we wanted to also look at besides just DNA: ballistics, cyber, and digital. And ballistics, of those 3, we've really have done a number of different, we've done a lot of work on it. We have some pretty solid findings on that. Cyber and digital are definitely forthcoming. We've been talking about it for a while, and John's going to talk about where, you know, what he's doing, especially with how forensic can support crime analysis and intelligence, criminal intelligence. You know, that's where we see cyber and digital really informing. And also we wanted to look at, you know, how police and crime labs interact. The police departments are definitely a big player here and part of this relationship, and we really need to get a better handle of that. So I promised you this would be a short presentation. John's probably wondering, like, oh my goodness, Eric, turn it over to me. So here's the meat of it, and I'm going to do this very quickly. I've been kind of alluding to it my whole presentation. You know, the findings could really be across a number of studies. Could really be summarized into a few key bullets, and I think that's great. When we start, we've done a lot of replication studies in the portfolio, looking at how forensic evidence is used in different jurisdictions across the United States. And, you know, although there's certain subtle differences in the findings, a lot of them just kind of coalesce along these major themes. And I think that's important when we're trying to communicate lessons learned to practitioners and advise policy on how to improve. So as we all know, nothing majorly shocking here, but DNA can probably be the most impactful when we're talking about the different types of forensic evidence in criminal cases. But that's a big statement, and there's a number of different ways to use DNA, and we find that DNA evidence usually comes into play more often in major felony cases, particularly sexual assault and homicide. Although homicide, you may be limited sometimes in some types of homicide in what physical evidence is there. But we were inspired early on by some of the examples from the United Kingdom to see, what can we do about property crimes? Can DNA really come into play here to clear some of these cases? And lo and behold, we did a randomized controlled trial looking at, we didn't choose which cases to test physical collected DNA evidence. We manipulated the timing, and that's how they randomized. But they found that DNA, when collected at burglary scenes and analyzed, yielded twice as many suspects as regular conventional investigative methods. And also, interestingly enough, those who were identified tend to be more prolific offenders in other crimes as well. And we just published an NIJ Journal article looking at cold cases and the prospect of serial offenders in those cold cases, and we bring up that finding that, there may be an opportunity here using DNA property crime just to try to net more serial offenders in multiple crimes. We're starting to see advanced DNA analysis methods come to fore. Danya concluded her presentation talking about one. We did a study with ICF looking at familial and partial match searching, and we found that many states didn't have definitive authorizations, but through conversations with crime lab directors, this is something they're definitely willing, and many crime labs were kind of exploring that. And of course, these findings came in 2017, so this may be dated, but we were talking about only a handful of states at the time, under 10, either expressly authorized these types of searching or expressly prohibited it. And many policymakers at the state level were just worried about liability and just wanted more education about what it was. It was hard for state level policymakers to engage in legislation when, this was a pretty esoteric conversation we're having about different types of familial or partial match searching when it comes to DNA analysis. And then also, and Kevin spoke to this a little bit, the relationship between the crime lab and police matters a lot in terms of backlogs and what evidence is being submitted. Having definitive policies on what evidence to submit, when it's going to happen, and what's going to be tested really goes a long way in helping curb backlogs from generating and proliferating. And then we had Peterson was mentioned. He did a study in 2010 for the portfolio. This was replicated by the University of New Haven in 2018, and then others looking at different jurisdictions around the country, and they all kind of tell the same story. James Anderson said a very similar story as well. We still, at this point, have a hard time having forensics impact investigations by and large, and this was found in ballistics too. We did a search of the NIBIN system and that network and what can be generated from it, and the potential is great. The potential for case leads is strong where there are sites at the jurisdiction, but there's just a disconnect in getting that information to detectives' hands in a timely manner at the time of that study. And then finally, and this was in response to the NIS report, but Arizona State did a study on how juries, how they consider forensic evidence, and they did a mock trial randomized control experiment, and one where they varied the judge instructions to the jury on what to consider. And they found that the experience in years of the forensic text was very salient in the juror's mind on what weight to give to the testimony. If it's been 10, 15, 20 years experience, then that's always stated, when there's testimony given, that seems to matter a lot. And John is going to talk about current work we're doing in, researching potential different avenues to having standardized guidelines for forensic text testimony and how those could be delivered in a courtroom. So I'll turn it over now to John, and he will round out the presentation.
All right, thanks, Eric. So one thing I want to mention too is that all of the resources that Danya mentioned from the FTCOE, as well as the information that Eric mentioned too, the publications and products from these research activities, they're all freely available. You can find them in the FTCOE website as well as nij.gov, and feel free to reach out to us if you can't find something that we've referred to. So I'm going to move on to other publicly available documents from NIJ. We have developed a number of strategic research plans, and each of these plans are 5-year research plans. So the ones that we've been able to inject forensic topics into the last several years have been the safety, health, and wellness strategy, the policing strategy, and the court strategy. So each of these plans has a fairly similar format. It talks about the strategic priorities and objectives for NIJ. So I'll just touch upon these as well. You can go to the website and download all the other research plans as well. The safety, health, and wellness is just like it says, is to promote research to help the physical and mental health of criminal justice professionals and promote science-based tools and strategies to monitor the health and improve the health. Policing, the forensic topic that was introduced in the plan discusses the examination of the role of forensic science in the investigative processes. And then just this past spring, NIJ released the courts plan, and that talks about the priorities of promoting and understanding the research to advance court practice, including the impact of forensic evidence on court operations, on case management, on case outcomes, as well as the use and court policies and procedures in using other forensic evidence. So I encourage you to check out these plans. They stand as a guidepost for NIJ's activities, and hopefully we'll build into our research activities from the next out years. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the solicitations that we've had since kind of the first, second, and third waves that Eric mentioned. And one of the solicitations that we've introduced forensic topics as the research evaluation on drugs and crime. And as you can see here, there's a number of awards that we've made in 2017. We made an award to Case Western to evaluate Cuyahoga County, that's Cleveland areas, heroin-involved drug investigations protocols. And this is a protocol that guides medical examiners and law enforcement in the collection and preservation of forensic evidence from heroin and other opioid-related deaths to help secure faster indictments and successful prosecutions of drug dealers in the cases of overdose deaths. In 2018, we made a related award to the University of Pittsburgh looking at novel quantitation workflows for drug surveillance. And so this project is assessing the protocols and collections of actionable real-time quantitative forensic drug chemistry information to support investigations and prosecutions. You'll kind of note there's a trend here. We're trying to look, instead of looking at the end result of using forensic evidence in the courtroom cases, but to actually use it upfront in the investigations. So similarly, in 2019, NIJ made an award to UAB to look at build cyber intelligence capabilities and methods to discover, disrupt, and disseminate information on illicit fentanyl markets. And so this is a collaboration between UAB's computer forensic research and their drug chemistry laboratories. And also in FY19, NIJ made an award to RTI to examine the prevalence of fentanyl and its analogs in court-ordered mandatory drug testing populations. And so they're doing this by developing and implementing toxicology methods to analyze hair samples to have a greater detection window for those types of drugs that are typically either untested in routine drug screenings, then also look at hair as a sample of interest beyond just urine or blood or oral fluid. And then just this past year, NIJ made an award to the University of Kentucky to develop a novel drug surveillance strategy to identify stimulant drugs and their concentrations using what's called a wastewater-based epidemiology approach to comprehensively, non-invasively monitor drug flows within communities in near real time. So I'm going to shift over to a few other solicitations where we've brought in forensic topics. In fiscal year 19, NIJ made an award to Florida International University under the Research and Evaluation on the Administration of Justice solicitation, and that project is to study efforts to improve juror comprehension of forensic instructions using randomized controlled trial to determine if instructional videos will assist with forensic testimony, both alone and paired with conventional instructions for jury understanding and comprehension. So this kind of flows from some previous projects that others and Eric have mentioned as well. And in FY19, under the Safety, Health, and Wellness Award, there were 2 awards. The first to University of New Hampshire to examine the impact of work-related exposure to child exploitation evidence on the stress, mental, and physical health of digital forensic examiners. It's also going to look at agency-level practices and training that can help mitigate trauma and promote resilience amongst the examiners. It's also going to develop a screening instrument to help agencies assess staff suitability for investigations requiring exposure to this type of evidence. So as Kevin mentioned in his presentation, NIJ is keenly aware of the issues that come up in stress, trauma, and vicarious trauma in particular with these types of cases. And under the same solicitation, NIJ made an award to RTI to examine work-related stress amongst medical legal death investigators, those that go to the scene and work with the victims' families, to inform interventions and preventative training to reduce and alleviate work-related stressors and improve organizational outcomes such as turnover, job performance, and improve personnel well-being. So as we know, this concept of staffing sustainability and maintenance and support for the staff is incredibly important. And then in the recent research and evaluation on policing solicitations, NIJ included research topics to address strategic priorities identified in the strategic plan to examine actual impact of forensic innovations on police practices and outcomes, such as through research related to the application and timeliness of data and outputs from forensic examinations, technologies, and innovations to support those police investigations, as well as systems-based strategies. And so the solicitation aimed to promote and support research to optimize workforce development for both officers and civilian personnel handling forensics. And that includes work in crime labs and medical examiner coroner offices. So while NIJ did not make specific awards directly related to this policing solicitation that were related to forensic sciences, the strategic plan still continues to serve as an example of NIJ's interest in these areas, and you'll see that in some of the other activities I'll discuss. And this is the next activity that really aligns very closely with that policing strategy, which is the development of NIJ's forensic intelligence model. And I saw a number of questions discussing the return on investment and the use and impact of forensic databases, such as APIS for fingerprints, CODIS for DNA, and NIBIN for firearms. And so I think this project speaks directly to understanding that impact of using this information upfront in investigations. So forensic data is typically collected, and analyzed, and reported on a case-by-case basis from crime labs for criminal investigations and court proceedings. But by gathering this, using this data earlier in the criminal inquiry cycle, forensic intelligence can be used across cases to help detect, prevent, and investigate crimes, and primarily to identify links, patterns, and trends across cases and correlate other information that can be actionable and used directly by law enforcement investigators. So NIJ is currently gaining information about the successful implementation of these types of approaches at the federal, state, and local levels, and also models that have been used by other countries, and we hope to report additional information as this project moves forward. So I'll touch upon a report that NIJ published back last year on the needs assessment of forensic laboratories and medical examiner coroner offices. Without getting too much in the background, this is a mandate from Congress to look at the workloads, backlogs, equipment, and personnel needs of the labs. But some of the key findings that we found, and we used Project Foresight data, working with Paul Speaker, to come up with some estimates, and used a lot of the BJS survey data. But sufficient and consistent funding and strategic planning is incredibly needed to address the increasing amounts of forensic evidence and address fluctuations in evidence submissions that are driven by the supply and demand of the forensic science requests. And so not only do labs need approximately $640 million annually to reach an optimal balance of incoming requests and casework reported, but it's also estimated that an additional 900 full-time staff are needed by state and local laboratories to address these workload issues. In particular, there's a shortage of board-certified forensic pathologists that needs to be addressed as well. And an overarching need is the increase of systems-based communications to help the communications between the forensic science laboratories and the service customers that they service. And so this report sort of exists as a framework to understand some of the new research questions that NIJ is exploring, such as what research approaches could be taken to address system-level issues in coordination amongst the system stakeholders. How can we examine the impact and implementation of new standards and best practices, such as those that are being developed by the OSAC and others? What research is needed to better understand workforce issues, resource constraints, and impact on court operations? And how can we evaluate the impact of research at these organization and system levels? what research and development is needed to promote the sharing of data, information, and other important knowledge in a timely manner, and how can we evaluate the adoption of new technologies by forensic practitioners to help augment the work that the FTCOE is doing. And finally, how can NIJ promote further research, especially projects that direct impact and include the participation of the forensic science practitioners. So I thank you for joining us today, because I think the participation here in the future will help bridge this gap to help understand and address these questions. So one way that NIJ has provided a resource to make those connections is through our Connecting Researchers with Forensic Laboratories webpage. And although this is specifically geared towards research partnerships on the STEM fields and physical science research, it can also be used to connect researchers with the forensic practitioners to generate ideas in advance of forthcoming solicitations, as well as once the solicitations become public, to make those connections. And so whether it's this website or working with the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, or even your local state and laboratories that in your surrounding areas, we definitely encourage you to reach out and make those connections. So that's my last slide, and I will turn it over to Eric to moderate the Q&A. So
Thanks,
thank you.
John. And for all of the participants, if you have a question for one of our panelists, please put it in the Q&A. And if it's directed specifically to a panelist, please indicate that. This will just help. We already have about 25 or 30 questions. Our panelists have a hard stop at 3:15. So if we don't get to your question, John and I's contact information is right there. I believe the panelist contact info might be on the registration page. If we don't get to your question and you still want to discuss it further, definitely feel free to write to John or I, and we'll, facilitate that. Okay. So one of the first questions we have, James, this is for you. And I understand the study was done a little bit ago, and you may not have specifics on this, but this came up in a couple of different questions. Could you tell us about how the labs were identified for your study? And if you have any information on that, we'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure. No. Originally we lined up, this was about 2012. Originally we lined up, I think, 7 or 8 labs. But we wanted to get jurisdictions where we had cooperation and buy-in from the prosecutor's office, from the labs, and the police, and the major police departments. So that was relatively difficult to do, and we also wanted to get a kind of a range of size. And if I recall, these were also NIBRS jurisdictions, or at least a couple of them were, for data. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it was essentially a convenient sample where we were aiming towards a diverse set of jurisdictions.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, James. While you're unmuted and cameraed, I have a follow-up question. Do you know if there was any division between civilian and swarm crime scene officers in your study? And again, that would speak to the lab.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to punt on that. I don't know.
No, that's understandable. Thank you, James. Kevin, the next question is for you.
Okay.
Thank you. When discussing sexual assault kits for old cases, how far back did you go to find jurisdiction under the study as far as reinvestigations of cold cases and wrongful conviction cases?
So with regard to the NIJ study, we were really looking at current cases, so the ability to either submit, or in the cases of the forensic lab, to process cases submitted within a year, within that calendar year. And then we also provided a lag period of 30 days within the following calendar year. So it's not necessarily, it's kind of challenging to collect that information via survey. So it's not sort of a dynamic measure. You're sort of taking two pieces of information and comparing them to each other. But that's what we are interested in, is the ability to sort of process the sexual assault kit evidence within that year. And like I said, some lag time allowed, 30-day lag time within the following calendar year.
Thank you. And this next question, I think Kevin will go to you, but I think it's applicable to all of the panelists. So we want to start with you, and then if James or Danya want to jump in. Based on your research, does it make sense to test all sexual assault kits or triage? And if triage makes more sense, what approach should we use?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recommendation we've come out with as part of the SACI project is a test-all approach. I think ultimately that is the best path for the system, recognizing that, similar to what I was talking about, there needs to be resources and accountability from policymakers, whether at the local or state or federal level, to make sure that we have the resources to do that. But we did find, in the absence of a test-all, there are some, I talked about the prioritizing the SAC evidence on the crime lab's part, and then testing the secondary evidence if the SAC kit is not successful. And then we also found that there was a positive impact on the law enforcement side, or I would say a negative impact. There were some agencies, we asked if agencies had a practice of waiting to hear from the medical providers before they went and picked up the kit. And why this is important is that there's some jurisdictions that haven't really, maybe don't have a sort of a coordinated process in place for moving the kits from the hospital or medical facility to the law enforcement agency and then to the crime lab. And I think it was somebody that mentioned even some places that are looking at sort of direct submission. So those are some other things that we found some promise for.
Hey, Eric, and I'll jump in with a comment
ahead,
too, and I'm gonna put a link in the chat box to the Stanford University paper that came out a couple years ago. But they did a cost-benefit analysis for testing the entire backlog, so testing all kits in the backlog, and their approach identified that for every about $1,600 spent to test a kit, avert sexual assaults, the after effects and all the other associated costs on average of $130,000. So there's some really good research out there. You can check out the paper, I'll refer to any other of the panelists too if they want to weigh in.
Yeah, James or Danya, do you have anything on this question?
I do not.
Thanks, James.
Me neither.
Okay. Well, Danya, since I have you, the next question is coming your way. Are you aware of any studies looking at the ROI of expanded CODIS and the types of offenses that improve hit rates versus unnecessary expansion?
I am not aware of any studies that are looking at the expansion of CODIS, and I don't know if that's a little bit of a loaded question on the unnecessary part there, but one of the areas that I know we're definitely interested in expanding some return on investment analyses is on alternative uses of DNA when you don't have the CODIS hit. So that's why in the coming soon slide, we did have a couple of, or I had one bullet point on the use of forensic genetic genealogy searching. And so I wouldn't call that unnecessary on one end. What I would call it is just complementary to the use of forensic DNA evidence to aid in investigation. So that's coming soon. We're looking at of starting that research here, or that evaluation here very shortly, and then also tying it into what does that look like from a legal aspect of it across all 50 states, with the ability to search against databases that are not administered by the Department of Justice or obviously FBI and this CODIS, the gamut. So.
And Eric, I believe that, yes. Kevin, I believe that Becky Gamble and some colleagues did have a paper on that topic, so that's something that I could track down and get to you.
Thanks, Kevin. And that's, for those of you who may not know, that's Rebecca Campbell at Michigan State University.
Correct.
The next question I can take initially, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists. And then, John, we have a question specifically for you, so stay tuned. For this question, much of the research presented here at the panel focused on quantitative approaches. What types of qualitative research has been applied to forensics? I'll take that since it deals with the portfolio in large. As far as the different research portfolios at NIJ, I think social science research and forensic science has benefited from a lot of qualitative methods. If you remember back to the presentation where we talked about those different waves, especially early on when the portfolio was in its formative years, we did a lot of qualitative research and facilitated a lot of different qualitative investigations. Holding focus groups with crime lab directors, looking at technicians and how their job went, the workflow going in, talking to state level policymakers, talking to police chiefs and leaders about just what is forensics, what is it now, what does it need to be, how could it best improve investigations, how is it used in the courtroom. And of course, I neglected conversations with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges as well. So there is actually quite a bit of qualitative work, especially early on. But even, like I mentioned, ICF was a major study in what I presented. Most of that was qualitative. There will be, national level surveys and some testing of efficiencies and return on investment, but a lot of it is just grounded in talking to people, holding focus groups about who the major players in the industry are, what do we need to learn from them, and that kind of thing. So I don't know if any of the panelists have anything to add to that.
I mean, I'll just add that I think, certainly we couldn't have done our study without extensive qualitative research and arguably the most important component to really sort of understand the dynamics. And at least in my research career generally, I certainly find that the qualitative stuff complements the quantitative stuff so importantly, because it helps you really understand what the quantitative stuff is actually measuring, which is, more often than you would like, not quite what you thought it was going in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I this is Kevin. I would agree with that. We did talk to 6 jurisdictions in the law enforcement, crime lab, and prosecution side, and I think providing a little bit more context. For example, we talked to multiple sergeants on the law enforcement side that supervise the sexual assault unit who had an informal submit all policy where it was where the evidence room would just process and batch the kits without approval from the sergeant, and they actually thought that was a great practice for them. I think it gave them a little bit of reassurance that they didn't have to find kits, that maybe they thought had been submitted. And then also on the crime lab side, some of the context around not just adding more staffing, but how to sustain them, and the issue of burnout, which was a major theme for them. So I think those types of additional contexts are really important.
Excellent. So John, I teed you up. This question is coming to you. How does the work NIJ does in the Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences, how is it different, and how does it complement the work that NIST does in support of the forensic sciences?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So NIST and NIJ have had a long partnership. There's a number of things that NIST certainly can do that we can't do. NIJ does not have a physical laboratory, and so what's great about working with NIST is that they have the physical laboratory expertise. We have scientists on both sides, but we're able to manage things in a way to complement the development of both the research base, the best practices, to complement the work that the OSAC is doing. One example is the OSAC. Not only are they developing standards for practice in all the forensic science disciplines, but as each of the OSAC subcommittees identifies the standards to be developed, they also are identifying research needs associated with those standards. So we're actively monitoring those research needs, and within our solicitations every year, we cite those research needs as well. So we want to be able to use our forensic science portfolios to build, more comprehensive support to what the practitioner community needs.
Thanks, John. The next question specifically for Kevin, but I think any of the panelists can also jump in as well. But Kevin, the question is, do you see some of the current issues in policing right now, or how I should say, the cause for reform in policing, will that impact staffing of crime labs?
Well,
that may be a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, one concern I do have is that, and I think you're already starting to see this in some police agencies and sheriff agencies, is a reduction in the civilian workforce, and especially when the crime labs are under the umbrella of a police organization, that could be the case. I don't know. I haven't heard of that happening yet, but I also mentioned this practice of what my colleague Jim Markey and I have seen and recommended as a promising practice, which is to have a criminalist work within a sexual assault unit to take that burden off detectives and have someone that's specifically focused on coordinating the forensic evidence also when it comes back from the lab. So that would be my concern, is also it could affect the crime lab, but also those operating within the law enforcement agency that have a role in forensics.
Donnie or James, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, you could make a case, right, that you should put more emphasis on the authentically objective forensic science if you have distrust of the potentially more subjective conventional investigative practices. I haven't heard anybody making that argument right now, but it's at least it's a logically plausible argument.
Danya, did you have anything to add, or?
No, I do not.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, and I see one more kind of distinct question from what we've already had. This is interesting. This is about the impact of COVID on forensic processing, both the collection and processing. And the question relates to the report to Congress and staffing levels due to COVID, but you could really expand it out if the participant who asked the question doesn't mind. What have we seen anything? It goes beyond the kind of the scope of the panel, but this is definitely a major issue for our country right now. So I'll just open up to anybody on the panel. Are we seeing a COVID impact to the collection, processing of forensic evidence, and also the staffing of the labs?
Yeah, this is John. I can start and throw out some observations, I guess. I think
we have Donnie after you.
Okay, yeah. I think we've seen a number of impact statements and response statements from professional organizations, not only to provide resources to their membership, but also to provide guidance where they can to safely operate and to get the resources they need to get the job, the day-to-day job done. In particular, I know National Association of Medical Examiners and International Associations of Coroners and Medical Examiners have teamed up. They started providing some biweekly webinars in the spring, and they provided resources on their websites. And so certainly death investigations, when you walk into an unknown or uncertain scenario, there's a lot of measures that they're taking, but also to meet the CDC guidelines for the collection of specimens for testing purposes in those types of investigations. So you look at the crime lab operations as well. I believe ASCLD and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences have put out information and guidance. So I think as NIJ, we're monitoring this information, and I know the question may have been specifically related to the effects on personnel and loss of resources and staff. This is something that we're very, very concerned and interested in understanding. What the short or long-term ramifications could be. I think that's something that is reflected in our greater interest areas and understanding workforce development. One thing I don't know if Daniel will touch upon it, but we've seen and heard federal, state, local laboratory levels that the remote capabilities for LIMS systems are incredibly important to continue doing the work, to be able to have shift work come in, to have in-person laboratory testing, and then, allow staff to then go home, work on reports and the, interpretation of data remotely. So there's a number of promising lessons learned, but also a number of laboratories that don't have that capability just yet to do remote access into the laboratories directly into the instruments that house the data. So whether it's remote or cloud resources, we're looking at expanding that LIMS report series to look at some lessons learned so far. I'll turn over to Danya.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. We are taking a look specifically at LIMS systems and how agencies were able to quickly pivot during this pandemic, especially ones that already had a lot of the electronic remote capabilities, and they were able to almost seamlessly continue work as usual. And then, there are other agencies that we've spoken to that did not have those capabilities quite in place as robustly as they had hoped. And, the challenge that presented, just even having to maybe change to shift work and having overnight work so that you did have social distancing in a lab, and what that even means for stress and burnout of the forensic professionals who are now on this, off schedule that they weren't used to having. So we are looking at that currently. So that is something that the FTCOE is evaluating specific to LIMS and shift work and the computing requirements needed with the lessons learned in that.
Hey,
Thanks,
another
Another
comment, just to throw in, I forgot to mention, is that I think it was through our Office of Justice programs through BJA offered COVID-related supplemental funding over the summer, and so that funding started going out the door incredibly fast once we understood the impact on law enforcement and law enforcement operations. So I believe crime laboratories had the ability to access that funding. I'd have to go back and check and see what the outcomes were on the forensic science community, but that is a resource that was available over the spring and summer.
Thanks. James or Kevin, do you have anything to add on this last question?
Nothing for me.
No, I do not.
Okay. Well, I think I took the majority of questions, the different topics that I saw, a lot of questions kind of coalesced together on the same general topic. I'd like to thank our panelists here. I appreciate their time to discuss this with us today, and also all their hard work in the research that we discussed. I want to thank the participants as well. This was an excellent turnout. We're very excited. We're energized at NIJ to be able to share with you the work we support and, really work together to promote fair and quality criminal justice outcomes as we improve practices and policies through science. So thank you, everyone. I'll give Jonathan the last word, my co-chair, before we end for the afternoon.
Yeah, I think stay tuned for what NIJ has in store for the future. I think we've definitely laid a framework to continue these types of research and opportunities, and also developing innovative tools for the practitioners. So I want to thank the panelists, thank the researchers that have already participated in this portfolio, and please reach out to us if you have any questions or need access to the resources.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.